So neocortex is, fascinating in terms of the tremendous diversity in cytoarchitecture that we see. I mentioned, for example, primary visual cortex as one example of that. How, Brodmann's area 17 along the calcarean sulcus, where all of these projections, these axonal projections that are coming, from the thalamus, basically, in the brain back into primary visual cortex back here. It's going to all those axons are going to synapse. Their terminals are going to synapse with cells that are located in the fourth layer down in neocortex. And I want to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. So here's again our caroidal section, right? This goes like this in your own head, right? And if we take a look here, you can see pretty clearly, well, as long as I get the reflection out of the way, okay? The surface areas of cortex. And if we're here in these lateral views, lateral areas here, this is the dorsal area here, you can see it's there's a gyrus here, right? This is neocortex. And if you were to go, let me see if I do this way. Okay, from the top, right, you'd hit cells, you'd hit gray matter, right? And you'll hit layer 1, and then you keep going layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, layer 5, layer 6, and then below that, you've got all the white matter, right? These are all the axons that are maybe coming from the thalamus, for example, and working their way up into, these layers of neocortex here, the gray matter here. Or we'll see, we have cells that are located in the neocortex too, in the gray matter of the neocortex, that are going to send their axons down, right? Maybe they'll go across the corpus callosum and then arrive in layer 4, of course, of another area of neocortex in the opposite hemisphere. So basically, neocortex, while there's a great deal of structural and cellular diversity, across the different regions, the 52 regions that were identified initially by Brodmann, and which are now being sort of subdivided further, utilizing newer techniques, both genetic and structural and functional. There's a certain consistency, however, in terms of the circuitry. So first of all, neocortex is characterized by 6 layers. From, if this is the top of a gyrus again, you're going to hit layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, layer 5, layer 6, and then below that is the white matter, the axons coming in and the axons going out, right? And the fourth layer down in neocortex is most typically the input layer for, let's say, ascending projections, arriving projections, axonal projections from the thalamus. So all of the, primary sensory areas, like primary visual cortex in the calcarean fissure back there in the occipital lobe, primary somatosensory cortex, we call that actually S1, which is, located in the post-central gyrus, in the parietal lobe, primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. All of these areas are actually going to be, receiving input, right, that was initially processed by a very specific nucleus, in the thalamus before sending those axons into, these specific regions of neocortex. And when those axons arrive, they're going to, work their way into the gray matter, and they're going to synapse with cells that are located most commonly in the fourth layer down. So I want you to remember that layer 4, from the outside down to the white matter, is the input layer, is the primary sort of input layer, in regions of neocortex. And then what's really interesting how your neocortex is organized, the input arrives in layer 4, but then it gets distributed up and down across the 6 layers of neocortex. And it's actually kind of interesting if you look at some of these like stained images of slices of neocortex, how there is some sharing of synaptic connectivity at layer 4, at the input layer, but then there are kind of discrete vertical, what they refer to as initially as sort of mini columns of interconnected cells that extend. These are all synaptically networked cells, going from layer 1, all the way down to layer 6, and below that is the white matter going in and out, right? So you've got these vertically interconnected, what are known as mini columns, that will seem to be doing some kind of processing of information within them. And then the more superficial layers towards the the outer surface of the brain, if we're talking about a gyrus, right, of neocortex, the layers 2 and 3 specifically, the cells that are whose cell bodies are found in layers 2 and 3, they're going to send their axons down through that mini column and then out basically of the cortex into the white matter that's below the gray matter of the cortex, and then their axons are going to work their way over most typically to some other region of neocortex. So they're going to then go to some other region of neocortex, and this is now from layers 2 and 3 basically of some area of neocortex. It's now descended and left and worked its way over into another area of neocortex where it'll arrive and synapse in layer 4 of that region of neocortex, or that mini column of neocortex, right? And then the deepest layers in neocortex, layers 5 and 6, the cells that are localized there will send their axons out as well, descend into the white matter that's below the neocortex. But these projections, from the deepest layers in column or mini column of neocortex, will head to something, most typically to something subcortical, like to go back to the thalamus, for example, or go to the basal ganglia, or brainstem nuclei, or the hypothalamus, or something. So they're going to be going to something that's to nuclei or to structures that are located subcortically. That comes out of the deepest layers of neocortex. So this kind of circuit, with input at layer 4, sharing up and down this vertically interconnected, column, what they call again a mini column, basically of interconnected cells in the cortex, right? And then from layers 2 and 3 having axons project out into the white matter to go to other areas of neocortex. Well, they'll arrive and synapse in layer 4. And from the deeper layers of this vertical mini column, layers 5 and 6, they'll send their axons down to synapse with the thalamus, for example, or with other subcortical targets like the basal ganglia. So it's a very interesting sort of repetitive organization, like circuit after circuit after circuit after circuit. And one of the things that we've learned about this kind of repeated structural feature basically in a brain, there's got to be something that's going on functionally here. Like what is the purpose of this, right? And I think this is like some of the more interesting aspects. So it turns out that those mini columns actually have functions, and with experience too, actually, depending on what area of neocortex you're talking about, several mini columns will become kind of interlinked together at that input layer. Like the inputs will sort of converge, and then the column will be made up of multiple mini columns. It'll be a bigger functional column, and where all the cells within it will respond to some functional aspect, some specific stimulus. And we'll look at a couple of specific examples of this, but just to give you one, like in primary visual cortex, many of those little mini columns become sort of start working and firing together in response to specific stimuli. And what drives the columns, the functionally interconnected columns, in primary visual cortex appears to be simple aspects, simple stimuli coming in, from vision, from the visual world, specifically bars of light, that are oriented in particular directions. So if you present a bar of light, that goes up and down like this, and you have to be looking straight ahead. So it's got to hit this one spot, right? For example, and then it's going to, work its way back here. And if it's this bar of light in this orientation in this particular location, this particular column of cells will fire off intensely. But if you then just turn it a slight tiny angle this way, that particular column will stop firing and the neighboring column will fire. And then you turn it again and then that column will stop firing and the neighboring column will fire. So you get these like orientation responsive columns, that are developed with visual experience actually early in development. But they they parse inputs into smaller, basic units that you can then build up objects and you can build up other aspects of your visual experience, by putting all these little, bars of light in various orientations sort of together. That happens like further along in the system.